Jangan komentar sebelum tonton video ini sampai habis ya.
Jadi biar Yesus tidak pernah omong aku ini Tuhan, lihat murid-muridnya omong apa. Tidak perlu harus Yesus kemana-mana, aku ini Tuhan, sembah aku ini Tuhan. Tidak perlu. Dengar kesaksian orang-orang dekatnya bilang apa. Bisa dipercaya. Murid-murid hari-hari dengan Yesus.
Say that it feels right.
Yohanes dan Petrus adalah murid-murid Yesus yang juga menjadi soko guru jemaat di Yerusalem setelah Yesus tiada. Silakan lihat di Galatia pasal 2 ayat 9. Apakah Yohanes dan Petrus beriman dan menyembah Yesus sebagai Tuhan? Tidak. Mereka adalah orang-orang Yahudi yang hanya beriman kepada Allah dan mentaati hukum Taurat. Siapa Tuhan hukum Taurat? Elohim atau Yahweh, bukan Yesus. Bukti yang lebih menyakitkan lagi bahwa Yesus bukan Tuhan dan Allah adalah di dalam Injil Matius pasal 26 ayat 56. Lalu murid-murid itu meninggalkan dia dan melarikan diri. Ketika Yesus terpojok dan akan ditangkap oleh tentara Romawi, malah semua murid-murid melarikan diri. Para murid ini lari meninggalkan Yesus, lalu mereka mencari perlindungan kepada siapa? Kepada siapa? Kepada setan? Murid-murid ini tahu persis bahwa Yesus hanyalah manusia biasa yang tidak berdaya menghadapi serbuan tentara Romawi. Yesus bukan Tuhan dan Allah.
Now what else do these scholars tell us? So Matthew and Luke are somewhere in between, but it is important to notice also that the scholars believe that Mark was a source used by Matthew and Luke in the composition of their own Gospels. But, as noted by F.F. Bruce, Matthew and Luke sometimes made improvements to Mark's Gospel. For example, there are improvements which show that in Mark's Gospel, somebody addressed Jesus as Rabbi, such as in Mark chapter 9, verse 5. But then in Matthew's Gospel, in the same incident, you can compare them side by side. You go from Mark to Matthew, the same incident, that person referred to Jesus as Lord. So in Mark 9:5, Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. In Matthew 17:4, Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. So in the one gospel, he's called Rabbi, the earlier one. In the later gospel, he's called Lord. So there is a significant improvement here from a Christian point of view. Second, there are improvements in which we find in the later gospel that Jesus describes himself as Lord. For example, in Mark chapter 13, verse 35, therefore, keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come. Compare that with Matthew chapter 24, verse 42. Keep awake, therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. Third, there are improvements in which the later gospel calls Jesus the Son of God. For example, Mark chapter 8, verse 29, Peter answered him, you are the Messiah. But compare that with Matthew chapter 16, verse 16, Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, Son of the living God. So the later gospel has inserted here, Son of the living God, in Peter's speech, as it is admitted by many scholars who have worked on it. And the disciples came up to Jesus and awoke him, according to Mark's gospel, Mark chapter 4, verse 38. And they said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? What did they call Jesus? Teacher. Again, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? In Matthew chapter 8, verse 25, same incident, they approached Jesus and they said, Lord, save us, we are perishing. What did they call him this time? Lord. It's the same incident, just the later gospel. The situation has been changed, or the wording has been changed. Then there are improvements to reduce Jesus' emphasis on one God. In Mark chapter 12, verse 29, Jesus was asked, what is the first and the greatest commandment? And this is what he said. The first is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. But then the same story is told in Matthew's gospel. What has happened to the first commandment? It's just not mentioned. In Matthew chapter 22, verse 37 and 38, Jesus just simply said the part about loving your Lord with all your heart and all your soul and with all your mind. And he said, this is the greatest and the first commandment. But that's not true. That is not the first commandment. The first commandment is, as it was mentioned in Mark, the earlier of these two Gospels. In the other Gospels, Judas Iscariot is necessary for surrendering Jesus to the authorities. But in John's Gospel, John it has Jesus handing himself over to the authorities. They do not dare arrest him. Just his voice blows them over. Why did the early Christians think that Jesus is God? It's because largely John's Gospel and this development over time. Thank you very much.
I became convinced that the New Testament Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses or by people who knew eyewitnesses. The first point to make is the rather obvious one that the Gospels don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses. They are all anonymous. The titles in your Gospels, the Gospel according to Matthew and so forth, were added by later editors. They were not put there by the original authors. Second point, none of the Gospels claims to be written by the person whose name it bears. They don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses, and they don't claim to be written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are later traditions that were added to the Gospels. These traditions do not start appearing for about 100 years. Some people think that there is an early church father named Papias who attests to the witness of Mark and Matthew, but in fact there are very solid reasons for thinking that Papias, who lived around the year 120 to 140, is not referring to our Mark or our Matthew. The first time anybody refers to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by name is Irenaeus in the year 180, 100 years after these books were written. My understanding of the Gospels, as they've come down to us, is that they were anonymous, and we don't know their names, and they're not built on eyewitness testimony. They wrote the Gospels in Greek. Jesus' language was Aramaic. These Gospel writers were living in a different country. Decades later, where did they get their information from? They were not the followers of Jesus. They don't claim to be followers of Jesus, the disciples. They're written by later people, decades later, in a different language. Where did they get their information from? They heard stories about Jesus that had been in circulation year after year after year, decade after decade, down to the time that the gospel writers living in a different country, speaking a different language, heard the stories. What happens to oral stories when they are transmitted orally? They change. The gospel writers have discrepancies among themselves because the stories that were told and retold were changed over time, and the gospel writers themselves sometimes changed the stories. That's why there are discrepancies. That's why scholars might be able to tell you generally what Jesus was about. They can list 8 things that Jesus did, but they can't tell you the details and agree. Why can't scholars agree? Because there are so many discrepancies that the Gospels are not reliable.
Yeah, so the last 12 verses of Mark are they're very interesting. Jesus has been dead, he's been crucified, he's dead and been buried. And on the third day, the third day, the women go to the tomb to see about anointing his body for burial, but they find the tomb's empty. Jesus isn't there. There's a young man in the tomb who says that Jesus will go, that they're supposed to go tell the disciples that Jesus will go before them and meet them in Galilee. The disciples are supposed to go to Galilee, and the women are supposed to tell them to go. And then it says the women fled from the tomb and didn't say anything to anyone because they were afraid. That's the end of Mark's gospel. It ends with the women not saying anything. Well, some scribes read this ending and thought, well, that's odd. I mean, the women didn't tell anybody. I mean, surely the disciples knew. And so some scribes added a longer ending. So the last 12 verses are this longer ending, where the women do go tell the disciples. They do go to Galilee. Jesus does meet them there. And this is the passage where Jesus tells his disciples. Matthew and Luke have many of the stories in Mark, and sometimes they have the stories actually in the same words as Mark. And for hundreds and hundreds of years, since the 4th century at least, biblical scholars have recognized that the reason they have so many of the stories in the same words is that somebody's copying somebody else. And so the idea is usually thought that Matthew and Luke actually copied some of their stories from Mark. That's why they're verbatim the same in so many places.
Terima kasih ya yang sudah tonton video ini sampai habis. Jangan lupa untuk share video ini jika merasa video ini bermanfaat. Cek dan share juga video-video kami yang lainnya ya.